Perhaps to explore this and more, we're joined via Zoom by international relations analyst Professor David Monyae. He is currently joining us from Bilbao, Spain. Prof, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us from Spain to weigh in on what is transpiring. We obviously, hearing reactions on the back of the NATO summit wrapping after 2 days. The Ukraine membership, as we know, is now top the agenda. Alliance members coming out to agree that the Ukraine can't join the bloc whilst it is still at war. What are your thoughts on what has transpired to date?
I think the NATO and President Biden in particular has been quite cautious. On one hand, I think he's taking a hard stand against Russia by pushing the very same issue that brought us here, the expansion of NATO. But at the same time, he does not give any guarantee that Ukraine will automatically join NATO, not anytime soon. As a matter of fact, the major condition is for Ukraine to win the war, which is unlikely. And therefore, I think there's still room for further discussions. I think for the world and for Africa, that takes an active, non-aligned position. These are disturbing news that we have a world in which the use of weapons, war talk, seem to rule the day. And therefore, there hasn't been any talk of peace in this summit.
What about Turkey backing Sweden joining NATO at this point? What does Turkey's yes ultimately mean for Sweden? And who benefits, the East or the West, perhaps going forward, given the dynamics unfolding? Does this also mean that Erdogan is linked to the West for 5 more years, seen as he's just come into term as president of Turkey yet again?
I think Turkey is moving from its own national and trying to protect its own national interest for many decades. Turkey has been trying to join the European Union, and there has been lots of blockage. And given the situation with the war in Ukraine and Swedish attempts to join NATO, I mean, it's an advantage that Turkey that is taking a move to give and take, allow us to join EU, and in return, we allow Sweden to be a member of NATO. It might win, but it appears that in the end, I think Turkey will give in to majority members of NATO.
Prof. Monyae, what about Beijing's reaction on the back of NATO's communique, portraying China as a major challenge to military alliance interests, perhaps given the deepening strengthening or the deepening strategic strengthening of China and Russian relations?
I think China response was expected. This NATO communique does speak to China, something which is unique. Previous NATO communiques did not venture into Asia, and we can see the previous NATO communique and this one. We see NATO gradually expanding into Asia, which is a worry not just for Beijing. I think it's a worry for the world that NATO is embarking on what it considers itself as a global NATO. It has already moved on the African continent. We have the experience of 2011, the bombing of Libya, and now getting into Beijing, the South China Sea, and the expansion towards Russia. These are not good signs for a peaceful world. We are entering a world in which the disturbances, a Cold War is emerging, where the West and NATO in particular is using hegemonic tendencies to really maintain its power and really use force instead of using multilateral institutions, the United Nations, to discuss issues and come up with means and ways of bringing in peace and security in the world, which South Africa and the entire Africa support.
Prof, I'm actually glad you touched on that point because I actually wanted to look at NATO's role in the Ukraine in terms of support. Should they be intensifying that support going forward? In the same breath, you've spoken about the changing geopolitical landscape and also their role across the globe. Really, what else should they be focusing on given these Cold War tensions, as you've alluded to as well?
The greatest fear we have is that if you look in history, the very first World War, Second World War, I mean, these were accidental wars. And therefore, the chances of having a Third World War through accident is very high. As we speak in the South China Sea, there's a lot of disturbances. And now we have a real hot war in Ukraine. And the hardening of attitude in the Western world and the move of maintaining a post-1945 world order using force, using military, instead of peace, negotiation, mediation, something that South Africa and the AU fully support. The utilization of multilateral institutions that we have for seeking global peace and security. We are no longer there. And it appears to me that we are caught between your hard attitude pursued by NATO on one hand, and the resistance that is coming on part of Russia, whether they're right or wrong, but I mean, it's a resistance in terms of avoiding having NATO on its borders. And China, one way or another, it will respond. In the end, we're going to have the disturbances, or a war more likely that will disrupt the global value chain that we depend on.